Let's dive into an explainer covering one of the most harrowing, yet deeply hopeful stories of human resilience I've honestly ever come across. We usually look at history through the lens of sweeping dates, grand battles, or shifting borders, but today, we're going to look at it through the lives of 15 infants. This is a story about the legacy of the 1971 Liberation War in Bangladesh and how a tragedy of unimaginable scale was met with just an extraordinary act of global compassion. Picture this. It's July of 1972, and we're looking inside an Air India commercial airliner, but the passenger setup is like nothing you'd expect. The seats, they've been completely modified to make room for 15 tiny cribs. And inside those cribs are 15 tiny faces. But here's the kicker, there are absolutely no parents, just a dedicated crew and a few volunteers. It's a pretty wild image, right? You have to wonder, how in the world did 15 incredibly fragile, orphaned babies find themselves alone on a commercial flight heading halfway across the globe? Well, to make sense of how these kids ended up on this flight out of Dhaka, we really need to rewind and look at the intense historical context that put them there. So, moving into Section 1, the cruelest legacy, the 1971 Liberation War. During the 1971 Liberation War, thousands of women faced mass assault. It left a devastating, bleeding societal wound across the newly formed nation. And when the war ended, that trauma didn't just disappear. It resulted in forced pregnancies, and these children became known as war babies. Tragically, society was so deeply scarred that it simply rejected them. The stigma was literally so overwhelming that mothers just weren't given the permission or the courage from their own communities to keep their babies. They were forced to abandon them, leaving an entire generation of infants with no names and no families. But out of that total darkness, a lifeline actually emerged. In 1972, seeing this heartbreaking crisis, the Bangladesh government issued the Abandoned Children's Special Provisions Order. This was huge. It was a monumental legal step that officially opened the doors for these war babies to be adopted internationally. And that exact same year, Fred and Bonnie Cappuccino from the organization Families for Children traveled all the way from Montreal to Dhaka, along with their friends Helke and Robert Ferry and Elizabeth Malling, absolutely determined to help. Which brings us to Section 2, A Morning in July, the Power of Names. By July of 1972, at Mother Teresa's Shishu Bhavan in Dhaka, there was this quiet but intense flurry of activity. Sister Margaret Mary was painstakingly preparing 15 babies. 12 were from Shishu Bhavan, and 3 came from another government orphanage. Now remember, the biological mothers were forced to flee without even leaving a name, right? So Sister Margaret Mary had to step in and give these kids their very first identities. She named them Shika, Ronnie, Molly, Amina. And we are talking about astonishingly fragile little lives here. I mean, when babies like Ronnie and Samar were born, they weighed barely 1 kilogram. That's just over 2 pounds. These kids were born into a world that, honestly, felt like it didn't want them. Take a boy named Batal, for example. His birth was the direct result of a forced pregnancy. Right after he was born, his mother tore up his birth certificate and literally just left. Sister Margaret Mary walked into the room, saw those torn pieces of paper scattered all over the floor, and she didn't say a word. In a moment of just profound, silent compassion, she simply picked up the pieces and she cradled the child. And that leads into Section 3, Flight of 15 Futures, Leaving a Scarred City. So, with the help of the local social welfare department and advocates like the Cappuccinos and the Ferries, the plans were locked in. Fred and Bonnie actually went to the orphanage that morning, looked at all 15 children, and ended up adopting 4-month-old Shika themselves. Bonnie literally scooped her right into her arms. Then came the crazy logistics from Air India. Like we mentioned earlier, no parents were on board to soothe these babies when the engines roared to life. As that plane lifted off the runway, the skies over Dhaka were gray, and the city down below was still visibly wearing the physical scars of a brutal war. But up in the air, 15 completely unwritten futures were being carried off toward a totally unknown world. Moving on to Section 4, Life Beyond Borders, Blooming in a New World. So how exactly does a story starting with such deep rejection turn into a massive triumph? Well, after touching down in Canada, these 15 children went to 15 different families, and they began to grow. It is seriously the ultimate testament to human resilience. Little Batal, the baby with the torn birth certificate, he grew up to be Ryan, graduating with honors in environmental science from the University of Waterloo. Pradeep became Matthew. Ronnie's adoptive parents kept her name but added Joy, and Ronnie Joy Morrill grew up to be a nurse and a teacher. Molly got her master's degree. Sabitri studied criminology. And Amina? She essentially made the entire globe her classroom.
traveling from Chile to China, Germany to Dubai. I mean, they didn't just survive, they absolutely thrived. Now, for Section 5, the light remains unextinguished, confronting the roots.
But identity is a really complex thing, isn't it? You can build an amazing life in a new place, but the echoes of where you started never completely fade away. Years go by, and in 1989, Ryan, the guy who started life as Baby Battle, decided to make a trip. For the very first time since that July morning in '72, he returned to Bangladesh. Just imagine the emotional weight of that. Stepping out of the airport, feeling that heavy, warm Dhaka heat, he realized the land was unfamiliar, sure, but it wasn't completely unknown to him. This was the soil of his history, the exact place where such a huge tragedy actually sparked his incredible journey. And you see this legacy living on in the next generation, too. Shika, that little 4-month-old adopted by the Cappuccinos, grew up and had daughters of her own. Sometimes they'll ask her, "Mom, who gave you your real name?" And Shika just smiles. She tells them about Sister Margaret Mary, a sister who looked at a tiny abandoned child of war and didn't see tragedy, didn't see a stigma. She just looked at her and said, "This girl has brought light." This story of the July Sky Children, the very first group of international adoptees from Bangladesh, really proves that the cruelest legacies can actually be rewritten. Those 15 cribs carried the weight of a war, but they were ultimately held up by this massive network of global compassion. It really challenges us to look at the tragedies happening in the world today and ask, how many other futures are out there right now, just waiting for someone to pick up the pieces and embrace them? It's something to think about as you keep exploring the history that shapes our shared humanity.